Hello dear viewers, welcome back to our channel. Before we begin, please make sure to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our future videos. Now grab a blanket, get cozy, and let's dive right in. Story number 1. It was Christmas Eve, and the snow had blanketed the countryside in a serene white sheet. Katie had been invited to her friend Emma's cabin for the weekend. It was a cozy little place nestled deep in the woods, perfect for an intimate holiday gathering. But as Katie drove along the isolated road, her car's GPS suddenly lost signal. The streetlights disappeared, and her only guide became the soft glow of her headlights against the falling snow. Katie slowed as she spotted something in the distance, a figure standing in the middle of the road. At first, she thought it was someone in need of help. As her car crept closer, she realized it was a man in a Santa suit. His beard was disheveled, and his hat drooped awkwardly. He stood still, his head slightly tilted, staring directly at her through the windshield. Katie honked, expecting him to move, but he didn't. She tried reversing, but the tires spun helplessly on the icy road. The man slowly raised his arm and pointed to her passenger seat. That's when Katie noticed her door was unlocked. She reached over in a panic, fumbling to secure it. When she looked back up, the man was no longer there. Her heart pounded as she checked the mirrors, scanning the area, but the road was empty again. Gathering her courage, she stepped on the gas, the car sliding slightly as it sped forward. She didn't stop until she reached Emma's cabin, where the warm light and cheerful decorations calmed her nerves. Emma laughed off her story, insisting she was probably just overtired from the drive. But when they sat down for dinner, Katie noticed something strange. On the porch, just beyond the frosted window, was a red hat hanging from the edge of a rocking chair that hadn't been there before. That night, as they went to bed, Katie's uneasy feeling grew. She locked her bedroom door and tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. But as the wind howled outside, she heard faint footsteps on the wooden porch. They creaked closer, stopping just beneath her window. She didn't dare move, her breath catching in her throat. The footsteps continued, circling the house. Then came the tapping. It was faint at first, almost polite, but soon it grew louder, more insistent. Katie mustered the courage to peek through the curtain, and there he was, the Santa from the road. He pressed his face against the glass, his lips curling into a wide, unnatural grin. Before she could scream, his hand shot up, revealing a set of rusty keys. He jingled them, tilting his head as if to say, "Merry Christmas." Story number 2. In a small suburban neighborhood where the Murphys were known for their extravagant Christmas decorations. Each year, their house transformed into a winter wonderland, complete with glowing reindeer, a life-sized nativity scene, and Santa's sleigh perched on the roof. This year, however, their display included something new. An animatronic Santa Claus that stood on the porch, waving to passers-by. The neighbors were impressed by how lifelike the Santa looked, with its twinkling eyes and perfectly trimmed beard. Little did they know, it wasn't an animatronic at all. That night, young Danny Murphy snuck downstairs to get a closer look at the Santa. His parents had warned him not to go outside alone, but curiosity got the better of him. He crept past the Christmas tree and opened the front door, the cold air biting at his skin. "Santa?" he whispered, stepping closer. The figure didn't move, its hand frozen mid-wave. Emboldened, Danny reached out to touch the red fabric of its coat. The Santa suddenly jerked to life, grabbing his wrist with an icy grip. Danny screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the wind. The Santa's eyes gleamed, and it leaned down, its breath reeking of decay. "You've been a naughty boy," it hissed, its voice a low, guttural growl. The next morning, the Murphys woke to find the front door ajar. Danny was gone, but the Santa remained, its hand now lowered as if inviting someone new to come closer. Story number 3. In a remote village shrouded in heavy snowfall. For centuries, the locals had whispered about the Kringle Curse, a legend that warned against staying outside after dark on Christmas Eve. They believed that if you did, You'd hear the sound of sleigh bells, and by the time you looked up, it would be too late. Maria, a skeptic and newcomer to the village, laughed at the superstition. She had moved there for solitude, far away from the city's chaos. On Christmas Eve, as the villagers gathered for their annual feast, Maria decided to take a walk through the woods, rolling her eyes at their warnings. The forest was hauntingly beautiful, with snow-covered branches glittering under the moonlight. But soon, Maria realized she had wandered too far. The path back to the village was gone, hidden under an unbroken layer of snow. Then she heard it, the soft, rhythmic jingle of bells. It echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing moment. Maria's heart raced as she spun around, searching for the source. Through the fog, a sleigh emerged, pulled by shadowy, skeletal figures that vaguely resembled reindeer. At the reins sat a gaunt, cloaked figure with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce her very soul. Maria tried to run, but the sleigh was too fast. The figure reached out, its bony hand clutching her shoulder. She screamed as the world around her dissolved into darkness. The villagers found her the next morning, lying in the snow. Her hair had turned completely white, and she couldn't speak, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Story number 4. On the outskirts of a quiet town stood an old toy shop, abandoned for decades. Its windows were frosted over, the peeling paint on its door barely visible beneath layers of snow. The townsfolk avoided it, claiming the shopkeeper had vanished on Christmas Eve years ago, leaving the store frozen in time. But this year, something had changed. One by one, townspeople began noticing the faint glow of Christmas lights flickering inside the shop, and soft music, the kind you'd hear from an old music box, drifting through the cold night air. Thomas, a local delivery driver, decided to investigate after finishing his last route on Christmas Eve. Curiosity pulled him toward the shop as he walked down the empty street. He hesitated at the door, noticing that the once rusted lock was now open. Pushing it gently, the door creaked, revealing the dimly lit interior. The shelves were still lined with toys, dolls with glassy eyes, tin soldiers frozen mid-March, and stuffed animals that seemed too pristine for their age. But the air inside was heavy, almost suffocating, and the music grew louder as he stepped in. "Hello?" Thomas called out, his voice echoing. There was no answer. He walked deeper into the store, drawn toward a display at the back. A life-sized Santa Claus figure stood there, holding a sack of toys. Its painted eyes glinted in the flickering light, almost as if it was watching him. As Thomas moved closer, he noticed something odd about the toys in the sack. They didn't look like toys at all. They looked like tiny, frozen people. Their faces were twisted in expressions of terror, their eyes wide and unblinking. Before he could turn to leave, the shop door slammed shut. The Santa figure shifted slightly, its head tilting toward him. A raspy voice filled the room, low and menacing. "Welcome back, child. I've been waiting for you." Thomas stumbled backward, tripping over a jack-in-the-box that suddenly sprang to life, its clown face laughing maniacally. The shelves rattled as the toys began moving, crawling and inching toward him. He tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. The Santa's sack opened wider, and the sound of distant screams echoed from its depths. Thomas felt a force pulling him closer, the air around him growing colder with each step. He clawed at the door, but it was too late. The last thing he saw was the Santa's grin stretching unnaturally wide as everything went dark. The next morning, the shop stood as quiet and abandoned as ever. But the townsfolk noticed something new. A small, lifelike figurine of a delivery driver had appeared in the display window, his face frozen in a silent scream. Story number 5. It was late on Christmas Eve when Sarah decided to take the shortcut home through Maple Street. She knew the area well. Every house was decked out with glowing lights, inflatable Santas, and snowmen. The street should have felt cheerful, but tonight, something was off. The air was heavy, and a strange silence blanketed the area, broken only by the faint crunch of snow beneath her boots. As she passed one particular house, she noticed its decorations were wrong. The lights flickered erratically, and the snowman in the yard wasn't smiling like the others. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque frown, and its coal eyes seemed to follow her. Sarah tried to shake off the unease and walked faster. A sudden rustling noise stopped her in her tracks. She turned to see the snowman wasn't where it had been. It was closer, standing just at the edge of the yard. She stared, heart pounding, trying to convince herself it was a trick of her imagination. The rustling came again, louder this time, and when she looked back, the snowman was standing in the middle of the sidewalk. Its frown had deepened, and its stick arms were outstretched. Sarah broke into a run, glancing over her shoulder. Each time she looked back, the snowman was closer, moving without ever appearing to move. Reaching her house, she slammed the door shut, locking it behind her. Peeking through the window, she saw nothing but an empty street. Relief flooded over her, until she turned and froze. The snowman was inside, standing in the middle of her living room. Its arms reached for her, and the last thing she saw before everything went black was its gaping, crooked mouth opening wide. Story number 6. In a small, snowbound town, there was a Christmas tradition that no one dared break. Every household was to leave out a single wrapped gift on their porch at midnight, addressed to the visitor. No one knew where the tradition had started, but the stories were clear. Those who didn't leave a gift would regret it. A newcomer, Eric, dismissed the tale as old folklore. He refused to follow the ridiculous custom, laughing at his neighbor's warnings. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell heavily outside, he settled into his couch with a bottle of wine, mocking the wrapped presents lining his neighbor's porches. At exactly midnight, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in his windows. Then came the knock, 3 sharp raps on his door. Eric froze, his bravado fading. He hadn't told anyone he wasn't participating. The knocking came again, louder this time, rattling the door on its hinges. He stood and approached cautiously. "Who's there?" he called out, but there was no reply. As he peered through the peephole, he saw nothing but swirling snow. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate creaking. Eric turned, realizing the sound was coming from the back door. Heart pounding, he rushed to lock it, but before he could, the door swung open violently. Standing in the doorway was a figure cloaked in shadows, its face obscured by a tattered hood. "You didn't leave a gift?" the figure hissed, its voice like nails on glass. Eric backed away, stammering apologies, but it was no use. The figure lunged, and the room was plunged into darkness. The next morning, the neighbors found Eric's house eerily quiet. On his porch was a single blood-red gift box. No one dared open it. Story number 7. In a remote farmhouse, a family gathered for their traditional Christmas Eve dinner. The grandparents had passed on a strange family heirloom, a porcelain angel tree topper, said to protect the family during the holiday season. It had always been placed on the highest branch of their Christmas tree. This year, though, 10-year-old Ellie thought the angel looked scary. Its glassy eyes seemed to stare straight into her soul, and its painted smile felt wrong, like it was hiding something sinister. Her parents dismissed her concerns, placing it atop the tree as always. That night, Ellie woke to the faint sound of rustling. The room was cold, her breath visible in the moonlight. She glanced toward the tree in the living room, visible through her slightly open bedroom door. The angel was gone. Ellie sat up, heart racing. As she strained to listen, a soft, shuffling sound came from the hallway. It grew closer, slow and deliberate, until she saw it. The angel, dragging its porcelain limbs across the floor, its painted face twisted into a leer. "Ellie!" it whispered, its voice a childlike sing-song. "You're not asleep, are you?" Ellie screamed, waking her parents, who rushed into her room. They found her curled in the corner, pointing at the empty hallway. The angel was back atop the tree, its expression eerily serene. But the next morning, as the family gathered around the tree to open presents, Ellie noticed something chilling. The angel's porcelain hands were now smeared with red, and beneath the tree lay a single gift, addressed to her. For Ellie, with love from the angel. Story number 8. It was the night before Christmas, and the children in the old orphanage were tucked in their beds, eagerly awaiting the morning. The caretaker, Miss Grayson, finished decorating the ancient tree in the main hall, stringing the final set of lights. This orphanage had stood for over a century, and each Christmas, the children left hand-carved wooden ornaments on the tree to honor those who had come before them. As the clock struck midnight, a strange wind swept through the building, rattling the windows and extinguishing the fireplace in the hall. Miss Grayson shivered as the air grew icy. Then came the sound of bells, soft at first, but growing louder. At the base of the tree stood an ornament she hadn't seen before, a carved wooden figure of a boy with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. She picked it up, noticing the strange weight and the faint smell of earth clinging to it. The name, Benjamin, was scratched into the base. Miss Grayson frowned. There hadn't been a Benjamin at the orphanage for decades. Suddenly, the bells stopped, replaced by the faint sound of footsteps coming down the hall. The children were asleep, and the doors were locked. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a soft, childlike giggle. Miss Grayson turned toward the sound, and her heart froze. At the edge of the shadows stood a boy, his face pale and his hollow eyes identical to the figure on the ornament. "Miss Grayson," he whispered, his voice cold and echoing. "Why didn't you save me?" The lights on the tree began to flicker, casting eerie shadows across the room. The other ornaments rattled on their branches, and one by one, more ghostly figures appeared, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They whispered accusations, their voices rising into a cacophony of anguish. Miss Grayson ran, but the shadows followed her, the children's voices echoing in her ears. The next morning, the orphans found the main hall empty, except for a new ornament on the tree, this one carved into the likeness of Miss Grayson, her face frozen in terror. Story number 9. The snowy woods behind the Hamilton family's cabin were said to be haunted, but 16-year-old Lila had never believed in such tales. Her family had spent Christmas there every year since she was a child, and nothing unusual had ever happened. But this year, her parents decided to decorate a massive pine tree outside the cabin, instead of putting one inside. It was a cheerful sight, glowing with red and gold lights, the ornaments sparkling against the snow. Lila had stayed up late, admiring it from the window. Around midnight, she noticed something strange. A tall figure standing at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the shadows. At first, she thought it might be her father checking the generator, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. Lila called out to her dad, but he was already asleep. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, stepping out into the cold. "Hello," she called, her breath fogging the air. The figure didn't respond. As she approached, her flashlight beam caught something that made her stomach drop. The figure wasn't a person. It was a scarecrow-like shape, wrapped in tattered cloth and bound to a tall wooden pole. Its face was a burlap sack, stitched with crude eyes and a crooked smile. Relieved, Lila laughed at herself. But as she turned to go back inside, she heard a scraping noise behind her. When she looked back, the scarecrow was gone. The lights on the tree flickered, and the ornaments began to sway, though there was no wind. Then she saw it, standing beneath the tree, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. The stitched smile seemed wider now, and the branches of the tree rustled, as if something was moving through them. Lila ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind her. But the scraping sound followed, growing louder until it seemed to surround the cabin. She peered out the window, and her scream echoed through the night. The scarecrow was pressed against the glass, its stitched smile inches from her face. The next morning, her parents found the tree outside completely bare, stripped of lights and ornaments. And Lila? She was gone, leaving behind only the burlap mask lying on the snow. In a small coastal town, the lighthouse keeper was a lonely old man named Arthur. He spent his Christmases alone, save for the light he tended on the cliffside, warning ships of the treacherous rocks below. Over the years, townsfolk had whispered that the lighthouse was cursed, as many ships had wrecked there, their cries for help swallowed by the stormy sea. On Christmas Eve, as Arthur sipped his tea, a sudden knock came at the door. He opened it to find a woman, drenched and shivering, her pale skin glowing in the moonlight. Her dress was old-fashioned, her hair tangled with seaweed. "Please," she said softly. "My family, they're still out there." Arthur hesitated, but stepped aside to let her in. She didn't move toward the warmth of the fire. Instead, she stood by the window, staring out at the ocean. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You must help them. The light. It didn't shine." Arthur frowned. The light had been working perfectly. He assured her of this, but she turned to him, her eyes dark and full of sorrow. "You let them die," she said, her voice growing louder, angrier. The room grew cold, and the wind howled outside. Arthur felt a sudden weight in his chest, as if the room itself were pressing in on him. He looked back at the woman, but she was gone. In her place was a puddle of seawater, spreading across the floor. Panicked, Arthur climbed to the top of the lighthouse to check the light. It was extinguished, though he had just repaired it that afternoon. As he tried to relight it, he glanced out at the sea and froze. The water was alive with shadows, figures reaching up from the depths, their faces twisted in agony. The ghostly woman appeared again, standing in the center of the room. Her face was no longer sorrowful, but vengeful. "You let us drown," she hissed, "and now you will join us." Arthur's scream was lost in the wind as the figures from the sea surged toward the lighthouse. The next morning, the townsfolk found the light extinguished and no sign of Arthur, save for a single set of wet footprints leading from the door to the edge of the cliff. Story number 10. At the edge of Pinewood Hollow stood a decrepit inn, long abandoned and rumored to be haunted. Once a thriving Christmas retreat, it had been left to decay after a mysterious fire took the lives of its guests many years ago. Locals claimed that on Christmas Eve, the inn's windows would glow with soft light, as if the spirits of those lost still celebrated the holiday. Sam and Rachel, urban explorers with a knack for ghost hunting, decided to spend Christmas Eve at the inn, hoping to capture evidence of the paranormal. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they entered the crumbling building, greeted by a strange warmth despite the freezing temperature outside. The main hall was eerily intact. A grand piano sat in one corner, its keys dusty but untouched. A massive Christmas tree stood in the center, its ornaments shimmering as if newly polished. Sam was drawn to a photograph above the fireplace, a group of people in old-fashioned clothing, smiling, but something about their eyes made his skin crawl. As they moved deeper into the inn, the atmosphere grew heavier. The faint sound of laughter echoed through the halls, and the scent of roasted chestnuts filled the air. "Do you hear that?" Rachel whispered. Sam nodded, but he felt uneasy. They entered the dining room, where a lavish feast was laid out on the table: turkey, candied yams, and steaming mugs of cider. But the chairs were empty, and the air was thick with anticipation. Sam reached for his camera, but before he could take a photo, the piano in the main hall began to play. Rushing back, they saw figures standing around the tree, their faces obscured by shadow. The music swelled as the figures turned, revealing hollow eyes and charred skin. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices hollow and cold. Rachel screamed, grabbing Sam's arm as they ran for the exit, but the halls seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning. The inn was alive, trapping them in its dark embrace. The next morning, Pinewood Hollow was silent, but locals noticed something new in the inn's window: a photograph of Sam and Rachel, smiling, their eyes dark and lifeless, as if they'd always been part of the Christmas celebration.